Truth and Lies Radio, a program dedicated to revealing the truth and exposing the lies about the destruction of your freedom and prosperity and what you can do about it. And now, your host, former Washington right-wing activist, international living, banking and asset protection author and expert, and American patriot in exile, David Finzer.
This is David Finzer, broadcasting for the next 2 hours from the Gibraltar of the Balkans, the historic city of Novi Sad, along the banks of the beautiful Danube River here in Serbia, on my 5,122nd day of voluntary exile in protest from an ever less free America. To comment during the program, you can send me a Skype text message at Truth and Lies Radio, all one word, or you can email me at david@truthandliesradio.com. As soon as our new studio is finished, you'll also be able to call in via toll-free telephone from the U.S. and Canada or via Skype from around the world and join the conversation or start an argument. Also, remember to check out our Facebook and YouTube pages at Truth and Lies Radio Show. According to the big clock on truthandliesradio.com's FATCA/Taxmageddon Day countdown page, your taxes will skyrocket and your worldwide privacy will expire in 152 days, 13 hours, 52 minutes, and 11 seconds. Well, the big news is that a Tea Party favorite wins in the Texas Senate runoff. The Hill newsletter reports that former Texas Solicitor General, that would be like the guy just under the Attorney General in most cases, I'm not sure in Texas, Ted Cruz, has won the state's Senate primary runoff election, all but guaranteeing him a spot in the upper chamber and giving the Tea Party one of its biggest victories in this election year. His win will go down as one of its biggest wins of the year, alongside that of Indiana State Treasurer Richard Murdoch's primary win, who kicked out long-term moderate Senator Richard Lugar, who should have been kicked out a heck of a long time ago. He was there when I was in Washington. He's been there so long, and he's always been the one who's walked the line between the Democrats and the Republicans, and was quite frankly more trouble than he was worth. It will also add another hardline conservative to the Senate, whose voting record is likely to dovetail with those who have endorsed him, like Senators Jim DeMint, Republican of South Carolina, Mike Lee of Utah, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, and Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. Cruz, with a Hispanic name, incidentally, is considered a lock in the general election. The state leans heavily to the left, to the right, rather, to the GOP, and the Democrats have failed to recruit a serious candidate for the seat. So it's going to be basically Tom Cruise versus nobody in the election. This is a good thing. The Democrats are going to have a really hard time keeping control of the Senate. Obama has not done a very good job, and his party is going to almost undoubtedly be punished for it. So you may have a situation where the GOP controls the Senate and the House, and who knows who controls. Obama may get reelected and stay in the White House, despite the fact he shouldn't be there in the first place. Now, proving that politicians once again have no guts, Senator Majority Leader Harry Reid, who's the sleaziest majority leader since Lyndon Baines Johnson, and House Speaker John Boehner, who's a typical get-along, go-along Republican that has been the cause of so many problems. He's a Bush Republican. I mean, that's all I have to say. Announced an agreement to avoid a government shutdown before the November election. Now, they agreed upon the stopgap measures which will help both parties avoid a major conflict before the voters head to the polls, when a government shutdown would pose a significant electoral risk to incumbents on both sides of the aisle. Isn't that great? That they are making decisions, they're avoiding their constitutional duty to fund the government, to have a budget. There has not been a budget in well over 1,000 days. I think it's approaching or over 1,100 days at this point. And they're making a deal so that the incumbents aren't at risk. That's why 95% of the incumbents get reelected. The incumbents ought to be at risk. People ought to be able to point fingers at them and say, hey, you didn't do your job. One of the jobs is to have a budget. One of the jobs, in fact, is to have a balanced budget, which they can't seem to do either. But being typical party people, and this is the problem that's happened in America today, is you have a Democrat party that leans to the left, a Republican party that leans a little bit to the right. The Democrats favor are buying votes from the unions, and the lower class Republicans are buying votes from the big corporations and their people, but everybody is against the middle class, and they're all part of the problem. Now, Harry Reid went on to say that Mr. Obama has also agreed to the deal. Of course he has agreed to the deal. He doesn't want this to be brought up. Then you'd have to talk about economics, and he doesn't know anything about economics. The continuing resolution will extend government funding for 6 months after it runs out on the 1st of October. That length allows the Congress to spend the lame duck session concentrating on the Bush-era tax cuts, which will expire at the end of the year, and how to deal with the $55 billion in defense cuts set to go into effect on January 2nd. So at least they'll be talking about substantive things, but, point in fact, they will be avoiding their primary responsibility, which is to pass a budget. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies. When we come back, we'll talk about the White House telling the agencies to spend like hell despite the budget cuts. See you in 5 minutes. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. Now, the White House is telling agencies even to spend normally, even as budget cuts are looming on the horizon. The AP reports that the White House is telling agency officials to, quote, continue normal spending and operations even as they face what the administration is calling highly destructive across-the-board budget cuts in January. I sure as heck hope they're highly destructive, because there's an awful lot of the federal government that needs to be destroyed, like about 90%. I remember when Phil Gramm ran for president. He was senator from Texas, and someone asked him, Senator Gramm, how are you going to cut the budget? He said, it's simple. I'll abolish all of the agencies that aren't constitutional. That would do it. What the federal government needs now is a lot of highly destructive budget cuts. It needs the wiping out of wholesale departments in government. It needs the firing of 90% of the government workers. We have way too much government, and it's getting bigger all the time. But that's just my opinion. Acting White House Budget Chief Jeffrey Zients says that's him saying President Barack Obama remains confident that lawmakers will act to address the automatic spending cuts, which would slash the Pentagon budget by about 10% and also slam domestic programs if the cuts were allowed to take effect on January 2nd. 10%, so what? They have to have a few less $200 toilet seats. So, it's not going to kill anybody. Zients said in a memo to the agency heads that the budget office will be consulting with agencies on how the spending cuts would have to be implemented if Congress and Obama fail to avert them. The automatic cuts were set up to prod last year's deficit super committee to reach agreement. And of course, now that they've been set up, they're looking for ways around them. There are lots of ways to cut the budget. One real quick way is to get our troops out of Iraq, to get our troops out of Afghanistan, to bring them home, to stop creating new agencies, to stop funding the IMF, to stop funding the World Bank, to stop paying banks to lose money, to stop big corporations from getting special tax deals that you and I don't have. That would solve a whole lot of the problems. But of course, those are all the things that make the elites that run the United States lots of money, because war means money, and it means jobs for the constituents of the labor unions, and it's all neatly bound together basically to take money out of the pocket of the taxpayer and put it in the pocket of the tax spender. Now, Let's change the subject a little. The Chicago religious leaders have hit back at the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who's closely connected to Mr. Obama. I think he was his chief of staff, on the Chick-fil-A remarks. Two of Chicago's most influential religious leaders have attacked Mayor Rahm Emanuel's criticism of Chick-fil-A's personal stance, the stance of their owners against same-sex marriage. We're not talking about anything Chick-fil-A as a company's done. We're simply talking about what the owners have done through their own private means, that Chick-fil-A does not discriminate against gay people in hiring or in serving them or in anything else. The religious leaders who support the traditional view of marriage were incensed at Emanuel's claims last week that, quote, Chick-fil-A's values are not Chicago values. Well, do not disrespect us. We too are Chicago, said the Reverend Charles Lyons, pastor of Armitage Baptist Church. He declared that Sunday from the pulpit on one of the city's largest churches, according to Fox News. And Cardinal Francis George of the Archdiocese of Chicago queried what would become of anyone else who disagreed with Emanuel. Must those whose personal values do not conform to those of the government of the day move from the city? Archbishop George asked in a blog on the Archdiocese website. Is the city council going to set up a council committee on un-Chicagoan activities and call those of us who are suspect to appear before it? Well, it's just typical Obama Chicago thug politics. You threaten those who don't agree with you. You try to punish them. Chick-fil-A wants to open a freestanding Chick-fil-A store in Chicago, and the city has said they're going to fight them. Fortunately, the ACLU, for once, has chosen to go on the side of the angels and is going to oppose that. Don't forget, today is Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day. So go out and buy a Chick-fil-A for me while you're at it. Show them that we have a right to our opinions too, and that we're really sick and tired of special rights for special people, or people who get offended, who want to offend us with their opinions, but then when we say something, have an opinion contrary to theirs, they want to take away our freedom of speech. It is just, it's a tempest in a teapot, except that it's an attack on religious freedom in the United States and freedom of conscience. Now, back to the budget again. Mr. Obama has said he will exempt all military personnel accounts from the $500 billion in defense cuts under sequestration, in a letter that was written to Capitol Hill on Tuesday. Once again, Mr. Obama has placed himself above the law and above Congress. He's saying, well, you know, the law says they're automatic sequestration and there's automatic cuts, but I'm exempting them because, you know, I am the ruler of this country and there isn't anything you can do about it. You're stuck with me at least until January 20th. The sequestration process is one where across-the-board cut spending are applied to government programs in order to meet a budgetary goal, and they're mandated by law. Acting Office of Management and Budget Director Jeffrey Zients told Congress the president is exercising his authority in the Budget Control Act to exempt military personnel from the 10-year sequestration cuts, according to the letter obtained by the Journal The Hill. The decision to exempt personnel will place further strain on budget accounts and defense contractors rely on for weapons programs should the automatic spending cuts occur. Now, this is all very curious to me for someone who ran for re-election last time as a peace president and who talked about getting the United States out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan. He could make up that 10% loss, that $500 billion loss, very quickly by bringing the troops home. We don't need another Vietnam, and that's what we're getting. And it's really, really bad policy, and unfortunately, I'm not sure that Mr. Romney's policy is one bit better. Now, but that's not the only bad thing going on. A congressional report blames 5 ATF officials for the Fast and Furious fiasco. It isn't looking very bright for Attorney General Eric Holder, the most racist Attorney General in modern times, even if Obama can somehow manage to con the American people and get reelected in November. Republican congressional investigators, according to the LA Times, have concluded that 5 senior ATF officials, from the special agent in charge of the Phoenix office to the top man in the Bureau's Washington headquarters, are collectively responsible for the failed Fast and Furious gun tracking operation that was, quote, marred by missteps, poor judgments, and inherently reckless strategy. The investigators, in a final report likely to be released later this week, also unearthed new evidence from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives in Phoenix, initially sought to hide from the Mexican government the crucial information that 2 Fast and Furious firearms were recovered after the brother of a Mexican state attorney general was killed there. But no, it doesn't end there. 2 more final reports, they said, will deal with the devastating failure of supervision and leadership at the Department of Justice and an unprecedented obstruction of the congressional investigation by the highest levels of the Justice Department, including the Attorney General himself. The men at fault are listed as ATF Acting Director Kenneth Melson, Deputy Director William Hoover, Special Agent in Charge, Phoenix Field Division William Newell, Deputy Assistant Director for Field Operations William McMahon, and Assistant Director of Field Operations Mark Chait. Every single one of these men has been reassigned to a different position since the Fast and Furious scandal. But the DOJ has shrugged this off and simply announced that they have put new safeguards in place to prevent this from happening in the future. What? The incident, the safeguards are to prevent the incident from occurring in the future or from it being leaked to the news into the future? Quite frankly, I'm betting on the second one, because that's the way the Obama administration operates. They want to, first of all, be above the law. Second, everything is secret. There are more secrets about this president than all the other presidents combined, and it's an imperial presidency that makes Richard Nixon look almost humble. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Afghanistan and a message that's been written there in blood but that no one wants to look at. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. I will be back in 6 minutes after the news and a commercial. Stay tuned. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. You can send me a Skype text message at Truth and Lies Radio, all one word, or you can email me at david@truthandliesradio.com. As soon as our new studio is operational, you'll also be able to call in via toll-free phone from the U.S. and Canada, or Skype me and join the conversation, or even start an argument. People ask me, where do I get my news? How do I decide what to report? Well, I start with the mainstream media like everybody else, but then I subscribe to something like 40 different newsletters, which I read, at least skim through every day to try to find news that's important that's being ignored by the mainstream media. And this came from one called TomDispatch.com. Imagine for a moment that almost once a week for the last 6 months, somebody somewhere in the country had burst well-armed into a movie theater showing a superhero film and fired into the audience. That would get your attention, wouldn't it? James Holmes times 21, he would dominate the news. We would certainly be consulting experts trying to make sense of the pattern, groping for explanations. And what if the same thing had also happened once almost every 2 weeks in 2011? Imagine the shock. Imagine the reaction here. Well, the equivalent is happening in Afghanistan right now, of course, minus the movies. It even has a name. They call it green on blue violence. In 2012 and twice last week, Afghan soldiers, policemen, or security guards, almost completely from units being trained or mentored by the U.S. and its NATO allies, have turned their guns on those mentors, the people who are funding, supporting, and teaching them, and pulled the trigger. It's already happened at least 21 times in this half year, resulting in 30 American and European deaths, a 50% jump from 2011, when similar acts occurred at least 21 times with 35 coalition deaths. I have to say at least there is, because in May, the Associated Press reported that while the U.S. and NATO spokesmen were releasing the news of the deaths of such acts, green on blue incidents that resulted in no fatalities, even if they were wounded, were sometimes not reported at all. This just comes back to my argument. I'm a right-winger, professional anti-communist. I ran an anti-communist foundation in Washington for 8 years. We engaged in what we called the private initiative war against Moscow. I've talked about that. There's no question that I oppose dictatorship and that I believe in the use of force when it is appropriate. But the United States has no more business being in Afghanistan if it had any business to be there in the first place. Historically, Afghanistan is the graveyard of every foreign power that tries to come in. In the 1800s, they called it the Great Game. It was Russia versus Great Britain. Great Britain coming north from India and Russia coming south, trying to control the Khyber Pass and then Afghanistan, because that was the Khyber Pass was the entry to the Indian Ocean, which Russia so badly wanted. Then we had the Russians did for a while occupy in the 80s Afghanistan, and the United States helped the guerrillas, the insurgents, I guess you would call them. I wouldn't call them freedom fighters, because having met them, they didn't want to impose freedom. They wanted to impose Sharia, Muslim law, which has very little freedom in it. But nevertheless, we supported them, and they managed to kick the Russians out. The United States got involved, and now, of course, they're shooting us. What are we doing there? Why is the United States there? Why are American men and women and our NATO ally men and women dying in a country that doesn't want us, doesn't need us? It's not a threat to anyone. It's a place that is an absolute toilet in the middle of the mountains. You've all seen the Borat commercials. Well, the place Borat's from looks like Hawaii compared to Afghanistan. So it's not a place we need to be or we need to worry about. And this shows that the very people that we're supposedly helping hate us and want to kill and are killing Americans every week, and nothing is being done about it. No one is outraged except the families of those who all they get back is a coffin, a body bag, and a folded flag. And that's pretty damn poor compensation for what these people have gone through. The Middle East is inherently unstable. An Egyptian spokesman has now completely disavowed a letter that was sent from the Egyptian president, the new Egyptian president, to the Israeli president. A letter to Israel from Egypt's new president, hoping for regional peace, kicked up a stir Tuesday when the Egyptian leader's Islamic movement denied he sent it. Israel insists that the letter is genuine. The letter was supposedly sent by Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi, an Islamist, and was in response to a message from Israeli President Shimon Peres conveying Israel's good wishes for the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. The return letter, released by the Israeli's president's office, was on the stationery of the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv. In it, Morsi appeared to write in English, quote, "I am looking forward to exerting our best efforts to get the Middle East peace process back to its right track in order to achieve security and stability for all peoples of the region, including the Israeli people." Now, aside from the fact that he misspelled the Israeli president's name, it's a nice letter. Then a spokesman for Morsi, Yasser Ali, said in Cairo that Morsi had not written the letter to the Israeli president at all. "This is totally untrue," he said. "It's a fabrication." He blamed 2 Israeli newspapers for manufacturing the letter, although he had offered no proof, and the letter was released not by the newspapers, but through the president's office in Jerusalem. Peres's office even asked the Egyptian ambassador if it could publicize the letter or if it should be kept secret. The Egyptian envoy phoned the president of Egypt's office to inquire, and then he told President Peres's aides that President Morsi's staff had given the green light to make the letter public. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry did not provide an immediate response to the issue. Obviously, what's going on is Egypt continues to be incredibly unstable. You still have a strong military. You have a government that was elected that is Islamist. And you know what that means? That means Sharia and all of the problems that come with that. And so this is just one more sign that the Middle East is going to continue to be a place of trouble. Now, when we come back, I'll talk about Israel considering an attack on Iran. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. I'll be back in 5 minutes after a commercial break, so stay tuned. Don't go away. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. Well, we're back, and we're talking about the Middle East still, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he's still debating with government advisors whether to strike Iranian nuclear facilities. I haven't decided yet whether to attack, Netanyahu said. However, I see the commitment of this regime of Ayatollahs to develop nuclear bombs that are meant to destroy us, and I will not let that happen. Netanyahu said media reports on a decision on Iran had been made are wrong and irresponsible, while describing the process as one that involves conferring with a wide range of advisors. The president noted that Israel's 1981 air raid on Iraq's nuclear facility was carried out over the objections of Mossad and the military intelligence agencies. Now just think about this. Put yourself in Israel's place. You have a crazy Islamist government in Iran that's totally unfree. Doesn't matter who gets elected as president. They have their supreme religious leader who runs this infernal theocracy that said over and over they are going to destroy Israel, and they're developing nuclear weapons. Now, what would you do? If you were an Israeli, what would you want your prime minister to do? I don't want to see a nuclear war started. But the great powers have done nothing to prevent Iran, and this could be the thing that sets off World War III. Remember, World War I was started by a simple assassination not too far away from here in Bosnia, where Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it ended up causing World War I. Now, there are a whole lot of people like myself who are strong supporters of the State of Israel. People say, well, but the State of Israel is racist. It's primarily for the Jews. And I said, well, yeah, that's true. But considering what happened, considering the Holocaust, considering the fact that the Western countries stood aside when Hitler said what he was going to do, when we could have easily stopped him, I'm willing to give the Jews a break. I'm willing to give them a gimme on this one and let them have a country of their own. It's a tiny little place that was a desert that they have made bloom. It's the only functioning representative government, free government in all of the Middle East. And interestingly enough, it's the one where they have citizens carry the most guns as well, which means it's a low crime area, but you do still have terrorists to worry about. Benjamin Netanyahu is doing what he will. I met him when he came to Washington while I was there. I was impressed by his strength and his commitment to supporting the State of Israel. You know, he grew up in the United States, so there's something of the American about him, at least the traditional American, which is fight back, don't give in. And considering all the crazies that are going after the State of Israel, considering the things that were done in 1948 to the Jewish people around the world when the State of Israel was created, I think he has some real serious thinking to do, and I think that the State of Israel needs to be supported. I don't think it needs troops. It doesn't need help from the United States in that way, but it certainly does not need to be held on a leash or held back in protecting itself. Now, moving on to an entirely different subject. I don't often comment on things like investment grade. That's something that we usually do on Money Monday with Mike Gard. But I just couldn't resist this one. A second risk agency has upgraded Uruguay to investment grade. Standard & Poor's has upgraded Uruguay's sovereign ratings from BA1 to BAA3, and that means that it is now changes it from the category of speculative to the first step of investment grade. Moody's praised President Mujica's administration for reducing credit vulnerabilities to regional shocks. Well, I'll tell you what. Considering what I know about Uruguay, having lived there for 5 years and having friends there and still having contacts there, this is insane. Moody's assured that a, quote, steady improvement in Uruguay's fiscal metrics coupled with a significant strengthening of the government's balance sheet, and also key was the, quote, reduced credit vulnerabilities to regional shocks in light of increased diversification and ample liquidity buffers, are a bunch of gobbledygook. You have a situation in Uruguay where Uruguay has gone from being a respected, neutral country that was the banking center, the private banking center for South America. It had strong bank secrecy. It had the biggest middle class in South America, to a government that is flat out communist. Now they call themselves the Frente Amplio, the wide front or the broad front. And it consists of a whole bunch of parties, including various communist parties. President Mujica himself was a Tupamaro communist guerrilla who killed people in Uruguay's civil war. His wife is president of the Senate. She is a self-confessed communist assassin. What I see is that Uruguay is destroying the middle class. It's making deals with all the big corporations, destroying the small and medium-sized businesses, exactly what socialist governments like to do, and it's being rewarded by Moody's and Standard & Poor's for doing this. And in fact, Uruguay is going to face a crisis. Property is vastly overvalued. It's already starting to weaken. And Uruguay is going to have another banking crisis because it has a government that is incredibly inefficient, that it owns a huge segment of the economy. All the power is concentrated in Montevideo. I mean, 2/3 of the people of Uruguay live on the coast from Colonia, which is just across the river from Buenos Aires, to Punta del Este, which is the big tourist center. And over half the people live in Montevideo itself. And the rest of the country is like empty. I have been to more of the departments, which are sort of like counties of Uruguay, than the majority of Uruguayans I've met. And it is so centralized, so structured as a centralist government-dominated country that it even shows up in the phone book. There are two phone books, Montevideo and El Interior, the interior, every place else. The government owns the oil, gas and cement works. It owns the telephones and the internet and cell phones, although they allow some competition in those things. They are incredibly inefficient. I mean, one of the first things I remember going when I went to Uruguay was a guy, it was reported in the press where a guy had retired after 20 years working for the government as an elevator operator in a building that only had one story. I dealt with the government, unfortunately, on handicapped issues, on issues involving the importation of my handicap van. I was fined by the customs for bringing in a van that I was advised by my attorney that I could, and I was not allowed to present a defense or call witnesses. In fact, I wasn't even present at the trial or had representation at the trial, in which they fined me $14,000 for bringing in, quote, contraband, which was in fact nothing more than a handicapped van. Now, those of you who are thinking about leaving the United States, if you read International Living or Sovereign Society, they're still pushing Uruguay, and they're lying. and they're lying to you big time, and they constantly make reference to Juan Fisher. Well, he sort of changed the way he renders his name since I started this radio show. He used to call himself Juan Federico Fisher by his full name. Juan Fisher, it was the attorney who told me in over 120 emails from his law office that it was okay to bring in my van, even though we found out later I was being lied to the whole time. He spent 12 years in the United States, so he speaks with an American accent, and he's a great rainmaker. People will go to him and hire him at paying rates 2.5 times the local attorney's rate, because they think they're getting an English-speaking law firm, and then that's the last they see of him. They get somebody else in his staff that sends them stuff in Spanish, and he gives bad advice. And I have a friend who's even who has spoken out against Fisher, and Fisher's threatening to sue him. And in Uruguay, they have a criminal libel law, and truth is not a defense. Well, now we've reached the top of the hour, so I'll be gone for about 6 minutes. But don't go away. I'll be back after commercial and the news with a lot more truth and lies. This is David Finzer. Stay tuned. This is David Finzer broadcasting for the second hour from the Gibraltar of the Balkans, the historic city of Novi Sad along the banks of the beautiful Danube River here in Serbia, on my 5,122nd day of voluntary exile and protest from an ever less free America. To comment during the program, you can send me a Skype text message at Truth and Lies Radio, all one word, or you can email me at david@truthandliesradio.com. As soon as our new studio is finished, you will also be able to call in toll-free from the U.S. and Canada or Skype and join the conversation. Also, remember to check out our Facebook and YouTube pages at Truth and Lies Radio Show. Well, according to the U.S. debt clock, the total U.S. national debt right now is $15,931,846,000,000, which works out to a debt per citizen of $50,727. And to show you the disparity between citizens and taxpayers, a debt per taxpayer of $139,669. Of course, the gross domestic product continues to lag, which means that the debt is bigger than all the total value of all the goods and services made or sold in the United States during the whole year. But when you look at all the debt that America is under from all sectors, it's an amount that just staggers the imagination. I cannot imagine if you took paper-thin cards and piled them in one pile how high that would be, probably miles into the air, because to reach this, it's $56,954,152, which is a debt per citizen of $181,343. As I tell people every day, Monday through Friday, America is bankrupt. Rome has fallen, the dark ages are upon us, and people just don't realize it. Well, I would be remiss because of my ancestry, which comes from Switzerland, if I didn't mention that today is the Swiss National Day. Today is the 721st anniversary of the founding of the Swiss Confederation by the signing of the Eternal Pact at Rütli by the first 3 Swiss cantons. Cantons are like states: Uri, Schweiz, and Unterwalden. Today, Switzerland is among the freest countries in the world, among the richest countries in the world, and despite its growth from 3 cantons to a total of 20 full cantons and 6 demi-cantons. Now, the demi-cantons are a uniquely Swiss utilitarian approach to government. Each of the cantons historically has developed with a predominant language, and there are 4 national languages. They are German, French, Italian, and Rheto-Romansh. Each of them is either Catholic, predominantly Catholic, or Protestant. And you had 3 cantons where you couldn't easily divide them, and so they broke up into demi or half cantons. And so it works out that you often hear Switzerland referred to as having 26 cantons, but in fact it's 23 cantons, 3 of which are divided in half. And so in the upper house of the Swiss Parliament, which very closely copies the United States Congress, each canton has 2 senators, and each demi-canton has 1 senator. Now, the Swiss Constitution, if you read it, is not a libertarian document, but it is a freedom document laid upon a foundation of utilitarian representative government, national diversity, and international neutrality. Now, let me explain a little bit of what I mean by that, because it clearly is not a libertarian document. It provides for government involvement in railroads. It provides for mandatory military service for all men between ages of, I think, 18 and 45. The great thing is it's universal military training. It's not a draft that you can buy your way out of. Everyone, all the men in that country, except those who are conscientious objectors who can opt for other kinds of service like hospital service or things like that. This country is armed to the teeth, and they're not just armed with pop guns. They're armed with real automatic weapons, with grenade launchers on them and everything else. I've seen pictures of them, and the Swiss, having lived right next to Hitler, know what goes on in the world around them, and the last time they were in a war was 1815. Unlike most neutral countries that when a war breaks out just throw up their hands and say, we're neutral, please leave us alone, as Belgium tried in 2 world wars and the Germans just rolled over them, the Swiss don't do that. The Swiss issue a declaration of armed neutrality, and they call up the troops and they rush them to the border to defend the Swiss nation. And every tunnel and every bridge coming into the country is already wired so that if they have to, they can blow them up to keep the enemy out of the country. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Switzerland, its history, its development when I come back. But right now, I have to pause for a commercial break, and so I will be back in about 5 minutes. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. Stay tuned because I'll be back. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio, and we're talking about my ancestral homeland, Switzerland. You know, they say that in the United States they need to federalize everything, they need to homogenize everything across the country, and it's amazing. Switzerland has taken just the opposite attitude. Switzerland, in its 26 different, we'll call them cantons. I explained the difference between cantons and demi-cantons. In its 26 governmental areas, 26 states, if you will, has great differences in government. Imagine a country where the president is so unimportant at any given point the majority of the people don't even know who he is. That's because of the way Switzerland's executive is set up. The Swiss parliament has a lower house that's elected by population, an upper house that's equal by cantons, and the parliament elects a federal council with 7 ministers with only 7 departments of government, and they rotate the presidency annually. So the president of Switzerland is simply the chairman of an executive council, because most of the power in Switzerland is vested in the cantons or even lower, because the Swiss Constitution demands the doctrine of subsidiarity, that everything must be done at the lowest level possible. Consequently, you don't have this huge federal establishment. You have tremendous competition within Switzerland among the cantons on taxes, on laws, on lifestyles, on languages, for example. 19 of the cantons are predominantly German-speaking. 6 are French-speaking. Only 1, Ticino in the south, is Italian-speaking. And then you have Canton Graubünden, and a little bit of Canton Ticino, where they speak Rheto-Romansh. And all of those are protected. It's the only successful multinational country really in the world. But it's successful because of this doctrine of subsidiarity. And so the federal tax rate is relatively low. I think it's 10.5%. And the rest of your income tax depends on the canton in which you live or in which you do business. Canton Zug, which is just south of Zurich, is sort of the Delaware of Switzerland. And they also have tremendously different forms of government. Some of the cantons have jury trials. Some do not. Most of them have parliaments, but a few do not. The smallest canton in people, which is Appenzell Innerrhoden, which is one of the demi-cantons, they do not have a parliament. Every year, all of the people gather together in a Gemeinde, a meeting, and they vote to make the laws. Now, that's pretty democratic. Also, they have the right of referendum. Any law passed by the government with a very tiny number of signatures can be called to a referendum of the people. And anything really important, a major change, a major treaty, if it has to be approved by a double majority, which is, means it has to receive a majority of the votes of all the people of Switzerland and also a majority of the votes in a majority of the Swiss cantons. So you don't have this 51% shoving down the throat of 49% democracy. And so you get to pick your place and the place that you find yourself most comfortable. Now, granted, it doesn't have a lot of palm trees and beaches, although they do have them in Canton Ticino, and some people might not like the weather, and it's not the cheapest place in the world to live, but it certainly is a country where there are lots of people want to live because it's safe, it's reliable, and it's neutral. It stays out of other people's business, and that's why so many world bodies end up in Switzerland, because it's the one neutral place. I don't know how good my German is, but to anybody who's Swiss listening, I should wish them, I've just been reminded, a happy Schweizer Bundeswehr, which is a Swiss Union celebration, I think, is a closer union feast. But Switzerland plays an important role in the world, and it's been attacked viciously by the United States. It's been attacked so viciously that I felt compelled to write about it, and I want to share with you this article that I wrote called William Tell versus Goliath. The modern-day Philistines are at the gates. The United States of America, once known proudly as the land of the free and the home of the brave, has become a self-appointed worldwide policeman and tax collector in order to fund its deteriorating economy and infrastructure. As such, the United States has targeted the freest, safest, and most democratic country in the world, Switzerland. This has been done to make a public example of the most efficient, private, and clean money haven in the world, the Swiss Confederation. Despite the fact that the United States allows the anonymous creation of companies with absolutely no due diligence or know your client, normally called KYC, information required, is the height of hypocrisy, especially when compared to the protections against criminal source funds Switzerland has had in place for many years. Anyone can incorporate a corporation or LLC in Nevada, Delaware, or even Washington, D.C. by phone and pay with an offshore credit or debit card or wire order or money order with no due diligence, KYC, or beneficial owner information whatsoever. In turn, one can apply for and receive while you're waiting a U.S. tax number for that very same company in the same manner. Even more hypocritically, the U.S. government allows a foreign nation, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, to operate its offshore company registry from within the United States, including forming corporations, LLCs, and other corporate entities, again entirely by phone and with no due diligence or KYC required. This is done by a company called International Registries, Inc., IRI, which is headquartered in the Washington, D.C. suburb of Reston, Virginia, near the airport. near Washington Dulles Airport and has additional offices in Fort Lauderdale, Baltimore, New York, Houston, and Long Beach, California. These offices form the corporate entities, issue apostille, which is government certified, formation documents, and do everything normally done by the government agency responsible for company formation and supervision. Among IRA's founders was Henry Stettinius, Treasury Secretary to President Franklin Roosevelt, and it's generally believed that the company's been run by Washington insiders ever since. Obviously, the U.S. applies one set of standards, or one should say no standards whatsoever to its states, and even one favored foreign country, and an entirely separate set of standards to the rest of the world, with a special focus of its wrath on Switzerland. Admittedly, the misdeeds of UBS and Credit Suisse by openly advising U.S. clients on how to evade taxes from offices within the United States has given this Goliath an excuse for its unprincipled and generally unsubstantiated libel and strong-arm tactics, which can only have an adverse effect on the Swiss economy and the hundreds of legitimate, well-regulated, and well-managed Swiss financial companies that have not engaged in the misdeeds of UBS and Credit Suisse. More money laundering and financial scams have been perpetrated right under the noses of the U.S. SEC in the last 5 years than in the entire history of the Swiss Confederation. Nevertheless, in feigned self-righteousness, the USA has launched a particularly vicious attack against the Swiss financial industry in an effort that clearly intended to harm the Swiss economy and drive the Swiss financial industry out of business. As the United States increasingly becomes a big brother police state, its hubris and a total lack of responsibility for its actions to find an outside villain, in this case, the Swiss Confederation. With the United States going deeper into debt every day, it is becoming essentially bankrupt behemoth trying to save itself by destroying all the world's legitimate money havens, and has started by attacking the most prestigious of them all, Switzerland. But this attack runs far deeper than simple finance. The United States government has abandoned the rule of law and its constitution, and thus freedom and democracy of the Swiss Confederation is offensive to the American political class simply because Switzerland remains free with limited government and a tradition of democratic neutrality that goes all the way back to 1291. Because of its unique confederal system and neutral foreign policy, Switzerland has managed to avoid all of the world wars since 1815. Despite innumerable outside pressures, the Swiss people have never given in to the temptation to meddle in other people's business and have backed up that determination with its doctrine of armed neutrality. No other nation of similar size and such limited resources has done so well for so long with so little. This is a testimony to the character and strength of the Swiss people and Swiss culture. Unfortunately, as I'm an American citizen who's proud of his Swiss ancestry, and I find the actions of the United States toward my ancestral homeland an egregious violation of its sovereignty and an unwarranted interference in its internal affairs for which there is no moral or legal justification whatsoever, and I pray God that it will come to naught. It makes me ashamed to have been born in the United States. Now we have to break at the bottom of the hour for 6 minutes for the news and a commercial, but I will be back, and when I come back, we'll talk more. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. To comment during the program, you can send me a Skype text message at Truth and Lies Radio, all crammed together as one word, or you can email me at david@truthandliesradio.com. As soon as our new studio is finished, you will also be able to call in via phone or Skype and join the conversation. Now, with the election coming up, you would think I would be talking about it more, but frankly, I don't think Romney is a choice. We have basically a left. It's sort of like the old Soviet Union, where you had right-wing communists and left-wing communists. You have a right-wing statist capitalist, Mr. Romney, who pretends to be a Christian but sells out his values whenever they're convenient. You have a left-wing socialist in Mr. Obama, who's one of the worst presidents in history. I certainly since Abraham Lincoln, and maybe worse than Abraham Lincoln, because this is the most imperial presidency I've ever seen. And unfortunately, I don't think that either choice is good for America. These are two bad choices, and the fact that the Republican Party has chosen Mitt Romney to be their standard bearer means that they are just about as bad as the Democrat Party, who once upon a time stood for the little guys, stood for the middle class, stood for traditional values, stood for a whole lot of things that I believe in and a lot of you believe in, and now has sold out to the victim groups. And it's composed of a coalition of people who want special rights for special people and want more and more and more government. Mitt Romney's not proposing any less government. He hasn't come out against the NDAA. He hasn't come out against the Patriot Act. He hasn't come out against the military-industrial complex. I haven't heard him talk about freedom at all. I've heard him talk about lowering taxes, which is a good thing as opposed to raising taxes. But he has absolutely been a failure, as far as I'm concerned, as any kind of a leader that any person of principle could really follow. And yet, as I read conservative publications, and I read conservative and libertarian publications every day in preparation for this show, nobody on the conservative side is speaking out and saying what a creep Mitt Romney is. Now that he is the anointed Republican, they've fallen in line, proving that they're not really conservatives, at least not as Barry Goldwater defined them. A conservative, I was taught, believes in limited government, free markets, strong national defense, and traditional cultural values. Now, this is not Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney certainly does not believe in limited constitutional government. He certainly does not believe in free markets. Because free markets, there's two sides to it. The socialists talk about fairness from one side, and the Republicans, the corporatists talk about it from another side. But a free market is one that is free from both government restraints that Mr. Obama would put on and government privileges which Mr. Romney would pass out to all of his friends. Of course, Obama passes them out to all of his friends as well. So they're both probably equally bad in that. I believe that America is a hopeless cause, which is why I am gone. I will continue the fight, but from a distance. Sometimes I feel like I'm operating Radio Free America. Someone sitting on the outside defending the conservative and libertarian cause, but I don't have to suck up to politicians or really care whether official Washington or the mainstream media likes me, because I don't like them and I don't want to be a part of them. The America of today is not the America in which I grew up or the America in which you grew up. Ever since 9/11, they've had a tremendous excuse to turn America into a dictator state, and they are doing it. The only real choice in this election is the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, with whom I'm not totally comfortable. I disagree with his stands on a few things, a number of things. I believe in national defense, which many libertarians don't. I'm pro-life, which some libertarians are. But I believe that if Romney wins, the way the U.S. economy is headed, we're not going to get anything better, and the economy is going to fail during his administration, which means the Democrats, the hardcore leftists, will win the next couple of elections. I would rather see Mr. Obama reelected, even though he isn't really an American, natural-born American citizen. I'd rather see him elected so that the ship sinks with him at the wheel, so that the Democrats are punished and the Tea Party people and the libertarians in Congress and across the country can join hands, and we can find another Ronald Reagan-like candidate, of which there are many possibilities, that can be nominated by the Republican Party 4 years from now and offer a real choice and not an echo. Now, moving on. I saw on YouTube today a couple videos about these warrantless checkpoints. And I wonder how many warrantless checkpoints we can really tolerate. You know, the police now want to know everything about us for no reason whatsoever, despite all the constitutional protections that we have. I think this graphic illustrates their whole attitude. Am I under arrest? What, and require me to advise you of your rights? No, of course not. I'm just not letting you go. Well, in fact, people who do say no politely, as shown on YouTube, and you can find them yourselves, there's 3 or 4 of them at least that I found, talking about warrantless checkpoints, where people stood their ground and said, no, I'm not going to answer your questions. I'm sorry, I want to go. No, I will not pull over there. No, I will not tell you whether I'm a citizen or not. Am I under arrest? If not, I'd like to go. People need to stand up and say no. If they don't stand up and say no, pretty soon no one is going to have the right to stand up and say no. Now, I understand that at the airport it's pretty hard to say no because then you're stuck not flying. But there are lots of other places where you can still, in a very practical way, fight back for saying no, because the price of liberty is indeed eternal vigilance. Now, when I come back after 5 minutes, we'll be talking about why capitalism has an image problem. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. Don't go away. I'll be right back. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio. Why does capitalism have an image problem? From the dawn of history until the 18th century, every society in the world was impoverished, with only the thinnest layer of wealth on the very top. Then came free market capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, the division of labor. Everywhere that capitalism subsequently went, national wealth began to increase and poverty began to fall. Everywhere that capitalism didn't take hold, people remained impoverished. Everywhere that capitalism has been rejected since then, poverty has increased. Compare Hong Kong to Cuba, for example, and it's a very, very clear, striking difference. Capitalism has lifted the world out of poverty because it gives people a chance to get rich by creating value and reaping the rewards. Who better to be president of the greatest of all capitalist nations than a man who was able to work the system by being a brilliant free market capitalist? Now, that was written, I must say, in support of Mitt Romney. I do not consider him a brilliant free market capitalist. I consider him a brilliant political operative who is helping to destroy America by using corporatism or state capitalism, which is not what has made countries great at all. Russia, under the czars, had state capitalism, and it didn't do very well. Despite that the proven history, though, of free market capitalism, capitalist has become an accusation, largely because of robber barons, people who've used capitalism in alliance with the government to advance themselves. The creative destruction that is at the heart of a growing economy is now seen as evil. Americans increasingly appear to accept the mindset that kept the world in poverty for millennia. If you've gotten rich, it's because you made someone else poorer. It's the fixed pie theory versus the expanding pie theory. Economics can expand. I can become more wealthy without you becoming poorer. The two are not opposites. What happened to the mood to turn the country so far from our historic celebration of success? Two important changes in the objective conditions have contributed to this change in mood. One is the rise of what is called collusive capitalism, or I call it corporative capitalism. Also, a part of that phenomenon involves crony capitalism, whereby the people on top take care of each other at shareholder expense. But the problem of crony capitalism is trivial today compared with the collusion engendered by government. In today's world, every business's operations and bottom line are affected by the rules set by legislators and bureaucrats. The result has been corruption on a massive scale. Sometimes the corruption is retail, whereby a single corporation creates a competitive advantage through the cooperation of regulators or politicians. This is good examples of this are Hollywood, which have gotten these copyrights that last forever, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, etc. Government collusion has made them bad. Sometimes the corruption is wholesale, creating an industry-wide potential for profit that would not exist in the absence of government subsidies or regulations, like ethanol used to fuel cars and low-interest mortgages for people who are unlikely to pay them back. Collusive capitalism has become visible to the public and increasingly has defined capitalism in the public mind. I've almost stopped using the word and try to use free markets instead. Because you have to remember, the founder, or the first theorist of modern capitalism, Adam Smith, said that never do 2 or 3 businessmen gather together, but that they conspire against the commonweal. He understood that businessmen would try to get the government on their side to wipe out their competition. And that's the kind of capitalism that America has today. And it's an evil form of capitalism because the state's involved in it. If you want to see that run wild, just look at Red China, supposedly one of the Asian tigers that's creating this huge economic monster where they have completely co-opted capitalism and made it government run by using slave labor and compulsion. This is the direction America's going. So if you like what's going on in the Rice Bowl, keep on voting for the people that are in office now, and if you don't, then perhaps it's time to take a choice, to throw away your vote, even though they tell you that is, to vote for a party that you believe in, to vote against the people that are evil, because remember, the lesser of two evils is still evil. And when you're looking at Obama and Romney, you have only the lesser of two evils. I want to talk a little bit about a subject that's rarely raised, domestic treason. President Teddy Roosevelt once said, "You must back the president and the Congress to the same degree that they back the Constitution." Well, based on that, I feel no obligation to the president or the man who acts as president of the United States, nor the Congress of the United States, because they and the courts have violated the Constitution in every possible way. Let's just take some quotes from our framers. I'm going to start with Thomas Jefferson. He's my favorite. When I was in Washington and used to get depressed at the way things were going, I used to go and sit at the Jefferson Memorial and sit there and sort of meditate and think about Washington as it was in the 1980s when I was there, and the vision that Jefferson had when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson said things like, "The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is as a last resort to protect themselves against tyranny in government, which is why it's so important that your members of Congress vote against ratification of the UN Small Arms Treaty." He also said the policy of American government is to leave their citizens free, neither restraining nor aiding them in their pursuits. Well, that would wipe out both candidates, wouldn't it? Because we don't need special tax breaks for businesses. We don't need special rules. We need equal protection of the law for everybody, and the only way to do that would be with a consumption tax and not income tax where everybody digs into everybody else's pocket. He also said no man has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another, and this is all from which laws ought to restrain him. So he doesn't believe in special privileges for special people. So the people who are attacking Chick-fil-A should just bug off because they're not supporting what America's about. He also said, "I think myself that we have more machinery of government than is necessary. Too many parasites living on the labor of the industrious." Now this he said when the United States government, the whole United States government, numbered in just hundreds of people, and yet Jefferson saw them as too many parasites. Remember, even up to Abraham Lincoln, the entire federal government occupied the White House, what is now the old Executive Office building, and the Treasury building. That was it. Jefferson also said, what country can preserve its liberties if its rulers are not warned from time to time that their people will preserve the spirit of resistance? People have to say no. You fight back at the ballot box, and you fight back with jury nullification, and you fight back by telling policemen without warrants no, so you don't have to fight back with guns. He also said the spirit of resistance to government is so valuable on certain occasions that I wish it to be always kept alive. It will often be exercised when wrong, but better so than not exercised at all. That just speaks for itself. Talking about democracy, the majority oppressing an individual is guilty of a crime, abuses its strength, and by acting on the law of the strongest, breaks up the foundations of society, which is why Jefferson, the great Democrat, the founder of the Democratic Party, didn't believe in democracy, but in a mixed government that was limited so that the majority could not impose its will on a minority. When wrongs are pressed because it is believed they will be borne, resistance becomes morality. It is our moral right and our moral duty to resist the destruction of American freedom and unconstitutional government peacefully as long as we can, and eventually, if we do not turn it around, if we don't fight back peacefully, we're going to end up fighting in another way. Well, now we've reached the end of the hour, so I just want you to remember you only have three choices. Give in and live like a serf, fight back first in November, and then when you can't stand it any longer in a civil war, which you will almost certainly lose, or get out and take with you the candle of freedom so that somewhere, somehow, someday soon, with God's help, the shining city on the hill will be reborn. This is David.